This is the Sony 85mm f1.8. It came out in 2017 and costs about $600 US. And for that price, it's probably one of the best value Sony full frame lenses that you can get. But I'm thinking of selling mine. Let's talk about it. Let's start with what makes this lens good. And as I mentioned, the best thing about it is probably the price and what you get for it. Full frame coverage and an f1.8 aperture at 85mm. That's one way to get a pretty shallow depth of field, which, let's be honest, can make a lot of shots look so much better. Even though it is an older lens, on modern Sony cameras, the autofocus is still pretty decent. Obviously, it's not going to be as good as newer lenses, especially paired with newer camera bodies, but it's good enough for most things. It's just noticeably not as good as much more expensive lenses, which is fair. The build of this lens would probably be a pro for a lot of people. It's pretty small and light, so it's not going to add a heap of weight or size in your camera bag, and it doesn't make a setup like this the A7 IV, particularly front heavy, whereas bigger lenses and heavier lenses can really front weight the setup. But it's not too small and light that it does the opposite, where I've noticed that can be the case if you have really small and light lenses where it's just not enough weight and size to balance it out, or it's just too small. So unless you're gonna build out a full rig, I think this is a pretty good size for a mirrorless setup like this. And I think that would go for any of the full frame Sony cameras, even the smaller ones like the ZV-E1, or the bigger ones like, the new A9 III. I don't know why you'd buy an A9 III and use an 85-1.8, but Personally, the biggest thing I like about this lens isn't really anything special about this lens, it's just the 85mm focal length in general. I just like how it looks for a lot of different types of shots. And this shot actually is at about 58mm on the FX30, which is an APS-C size sensor. So it's gonna be roughly a full frame equivalent of about 85mm. But 85mm as a focal length is great for isolating subjects, especially at f1.8. Okay, now where this lens kind of sucks, because it's a very budget lens, the glass inside is just not that good. So it's not going to be particularly sharp or clean, especially compared to more expensive lenses. The biggest thing that I've noticed with this lens is chromatic aberration, which, if you're unaware, is when edges, particularly high contrast edges, will have this colored fringing. Usually it'll be a green or magenta shift on either side of the focal plane. So edges that are slightly out of focus on the far side will have fringing of one color, and then edges on the close side of the focus plane will have fringing of the other color. This lens tends to have pretty obvious magenta fringing, and I've noticed it particularly when shooting shots of other lenses like this, where you have writing or other markings on the lenses, and it's just obvious enough that it can kind of take you out of it because it's distracting, that there's just these, colored lines where there shouldn't be any color. Also vignetting when wide open, and just kind of a general lack of sharpness compared to better lenses. But that's kind of expected. The other three things that I don't particularly like about this lens are related to focusing. Firstly, the close focus distance is 80 centimeters, which means you basically can't get very tight detail shots because it's not even remotely close to having any sort of macro capability. I've mostly found this annoying when trying to shoot B-roll or product shots where I want to get close, but you just can't. And then when it comes to manual focusing, of course, being an older photography lens, it is focused by wire, which means the focus ring itself doesn't move anything mechanically. It, sends the electrical signal to move the motors. And it's also not linear. So for video, manual focusing generally is just not great with this lens. But also the focus ring just isn't that smooth, especially compared to this 20mm 1.8, which is a very smooth, albeit very light focus ring. It's just kind of night and day. So generally I wouldn't recommend trying to do any manual focus pulls with this lens. Also, it does focus breathe quite a lot, and because it is an older lens and it's not a G or G Master series lens, you can't use the focus breathing compensation that are in these modern cameras because that is reserved for those G and G Master lenses. Okay, so we've established that this lens has a few things going for it and a few things that it's not very good at. But why am I thinking of selling it if it's one of the best value full frame Sony lenses and I like the focal length? The biggest reason is I just don't use it that much, and Honestly, it's kind of redundant in my kit now, and it has been for a while. As you know, I have the 7200 G Master Mark II, which is a better lens in every single way, except for aperture. It can't go to 1.8. And I guess size, weight, and price, but none of those really bother me that much. I also have the Sigma 24-70 f2.8 that I'm shooting on now that can get close enough to 85mm that in most cases it'll do. So there's very few cases where it makes sense for me to use this lens. The only things that I could think of would be if I need the wider aperture for low light, or if I'm running it on a gimbal, because this is a lot easier to run on a gimbal than this. But both of those scenarios are pretty rare for me. And as much as I like the 85mm focal length, it's kind of just too tight for a lot of things, especially on the FX30, which is a crop sensor camera. So it would have the field of view of about a 127mm on full frame. To make a focal length like that work, you need a lot of space, which often I don't have when I'm shooting shots like this. But again, if I need a more telephoto shot, I have the 7200 and I'll just use this almost every time. It's also fairly common advice to invest in better lenses rather than better camera bodies, because generally an okay versus a very good lens is going to be more noticeable than an okay versus a very good camera body. Hence why I have a lens that costs more than either of my cameras. And as I'm slowly getting more and more into video, I'm not planning on getting that many more photography lenses. And I actually have a 50mm cinema lens on its way. I will be doing a live unboxing of that, so if that hasn't happened yet, make sure you subscribe so you can watch that. Otherwise, if it already has happened, go watch it after this. So yeah, that's the Sony 85mm 1.8 and why I think it is a great value lens, maybe even the best value, but I'm not gonna be keeping mine. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. If you've used this lens, what do you think about it? If you haven't, let me know any questions you have in the comments. Do all the other things. Go watch one of my other lens related videos, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.